young Jimmy, not this Jimmy, an older one, was very proud in his Sunday school class to announce that he had been chosen to read the Bible in church. It was before email, so he was actually handed a piece of paper that had the readings written down. And so he said to his class, I'm so excited. And what are you going to read from, Jimmy? I'm going to read from the Gossip according to John. Well, actually, that was pretty accurate, except today it's the Gossip according to Luke. And Luke has this story, which, in fact, if you read the details very closely, doesn't actually say that John did the baptizing of Jesus. It said when he was baptized. And one assumes from the other gossips that it may well have been John who did the baptizing. But right from birth, I believe Jesus listened. He listened to sounds. He listened to voices. He listened to his mother singing. Remember that story where Mary sings when she is given the message that she will bear a child? I guess she was one who went about the housework singing. She may well have joined the local choir. Who knows? But Jesus listened. And a lot of his stories, you will know, must have come from his listening. He listened to the birds. He listened to the thunder. He listened to the rain. He listened to the quiet breezes blowing in the trees around. He listened. And as he grew, he listened to the people in the villages. He listened to the concerns of people. He listened as butchers do and hairdressers listen to people's moans and groans about the government and what's going wrong and who should do something about it. And I guess in listening to these voices there grew that kind of understanding that somebody had to do something. And then came the time when he stepped into the mud. I came across that phrase by the chaplain to Nairobi University that wrote some really interesting studies on the Gospels. And on the particular story of Jesus being baptized, he heads it, he stepped into the mud. Well, I don't know whether you've ever stepped into a river and you can't see the bottom and your feet that are bare and the mud squelches up between your toes and you kind of wonder what's going to nip. Oh, I can see Anne has had that experience. Was it a crab? Oh, well, we'll quickly get off that subject. But stepping into the mud is getting down to where it really is dirty. And that's exactly what happened when Jesus was baptized. He stepped into the mud of the world. Now, I mentioned that Jesus had listened. He wasn't the first one to listen to God. He wasn't the first one to hear some direction for his life. You may recall the Isaiah passage that we heard just now. And so many of the prophets speak as God was speaking, as they heard and saw the demands of the world in which they were situated. The prophets heard a word to be said to that community at that time. And Jesus understood himself to hear a voice. And the Gospels record, the gossips record, that Jesus responded to that voice. There was a need for a leader. And people had asked the question, was John the leader? John, of course, is Jesus' cousin. We understand that he may well have been brought up in the Essene community, a community of discipline and learning and hearing what God was saying. So Jesus gradually heard the call to be that leader and to be a voice of God to the people, for the people, amongst the people. That's what his baptism was about. Dr. Luke, in his gossiping, is not so much interested in the details of the baptism as what happened and where Jesus went from that occasion. Now, when Jesus stepped out into the world, he was confronted with people with demands, and he had to soon work out how he would fulfill his ministry. We heard that at the beginning of Dr. Luke, when Jesus is the synagogue, and he reads from the scripture. Now, some of us, the fellowship, have attended the Bar Shalom, the synagogue on Hackney Road. And the scriptures are on a scroll and are opened and are read, and it's left at that point for the next week. And it just so happened that the day Jesus was in the synagogue, it happened to be the passage that talked about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the poor, to release to the captives, sight to the blind. And he said, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Now, if that's not a moment when he heard the voice of God, as it were, calling him to be that person to announce the good news to the people, then I don't know what it is. Baptism was the beginning of Jesus' ministry to fulfill that word from Isaiah. Is that not a kind of parable for us? What is baptism? Over the years, I've had a number of baptisms. And sometimes it's been very hard to try and not argue, but to kind of persuade people that it isn't really about a ticket to heaven. You know, if you're baptised, you're guaranteed of a spot. It really isn't about that. It's more about signing up for a ministry. It's about being involved in the same ministry as Jesus. And when there are people who are in the position that's described by Isaiah, as long as there are people like that, then we're involved in that mission. It's a call to be involved in the world, not removed from it. I remember growing up as a young person. Yes, I do remember that. That there was this sort of belief that to be a Christian, you were taken out of the world. You were separated from the world. But this story well and truly underlines that Jesus' ministry was in the world, not removed from it. So little Jimmy, when he talked about reading from the gossip according to John, today we've listened to the gossip according to Luke. And according to Luke, when Jesus stepped into the mud, he was actually, when he listened as a child, he may well have heard his mother talking about the time when she accepted God's ministry. When she heard the call, she said yes. And that's the call that Jesus heard when he was baptized. He said yes to God's call to mission, to be involved in the world, to hear the cry of the people and to respond with justice and with love and with compassion. Baptism reminds me whose I am and who I am. Amen.